Story 1. In a movie theater before the film started, a group of women spoke in Polish, wondering if my hair was real, blonde, and very curly. They discussed pulling on it to check. I turned around and told them it was real and that there would be problems if they touched it. They stopped talking after that. Story 2. Not me, but my gran. She was evacuated from London to rural Wales during the war when she was about 15. She spoke with a clear South London accent. Some older women on the bus were talking badly about her, as the locals tended to do about evacuees. They did not know my gran had been raised by her Welsh grandmother and spoke Welsh fluently. She told the women off and walked off the bus with her head held high. In her later years, she did not have much short-term memory, but she still loved telling me that story. Story 3, not quite. I'd been learning some Spanish on my own. One of my new jobs was working with a woman who spoke Spanish. I later found out she was highly judgmental. She was talking with someone on her phone in Spanish. I didn't understand a word and didn't care. At our next job, someone asked how to say, "How do you say?" in Spanish, and I blurted out the response. Her face went pale. Maybe she wasn't talking about me in the earlier conversation, but the look was priceless. Story 4. I'm a jeweler and sometimes do pop-up art shows with a booth displaying my work for sale. A German family was in my booth discussing my pieces and complimenting them, so I did not interrupt. They bought a bracelet and completed the transaction in English. As they were leaving, I said "Tschüss," which is an informal German way of saying goodbye. They reacted in German, saying "Bye, wait, what?" Then they ran back into the booth, excited and laughing, and surrounded me. I thanked them for the compliments. They kept laughing. It was a very cute interaction. Story 5. A white American friend spent time in southern China as a student where he learned to speak Hakka fluently. He was walking through Chinatown in New York City one day when he overheard two men having a heated argument in Hakka. They were on the verge of a physical altercation. When my friend walked up and said something like, "What is going on here in Hakka?" they were so gobsmacked that they regained their composure. He chatted with both of them for a short time. They were deeply amused by his fluency, and everyone went on their way. The fight was averted. Story 6. This has happened a couple of times. Both were pleasant. On one occasion, while we were abroad at a farmer's market, I stood in front of a stall looking at items. My wife stood to my right and two women stood to her right. The two women noticed my wife and began speaking to each other about her eyes and how beautiful they thought she was. I smiled as I listened, and at some point I looked at them. They realized I understood. They nudged each other, smiled back, and moved on. I told my wife after they left, and she was happy. Story 7. He walked by and, in Spanish, asked why this lady had so many plants while I crouched behind a bush checking on them. Story 8. I live in Washington, District of Columbia, and between diplomats, members of the armed forces and intelligence agencies, and tourists, you can never tell who might understand which languages. This happened before smartphones. A small group of tourists were speaking among themselves, trying to figure out how to get to a tourist attraction. An older, well-dressed African gentleman approached them and helped in their language. I was waiting at the crosswalk next to him afterward and asked what language they had been speaking. He said it was Russian and that he was a diplomat from Nigeria who had learned Russian earlier in his career. Story 9. I had just sat down and ordered some cevapi at a restaurant overlooking Zagreb's Central Square when a woman approached and asked in broken English if she and her family could have my table. I told her politely that I had just ordered and would be another 20 to 30 minutes. She rudely complained in Croatian, "These stupid, fat fucking Americans have no respect for the locals, and I hope you choke on your food." I replied in perfect Croatian, thanks to my grandmother, "First, I'm Australian, and second, you can fuck off into your mother's three cunts." People who know the language will understand the translation. The look on her face was priceless. Story 10. I tried to sell gold at a family-run precious metals store where the owners, a mother, a father, and their son, did not realize I could understand them. I overheard their negotiation strategy while we haggled. They kept lowballing me, so I left and sold my gold at a different store. Story 11. A friend and I were sitting in a guest house common room when a Japanese woman and her boyfriend arrived. The woman was making fun of my friend for not being able to use chopsticks, while her boyfriend looked embarrassed by her talking like that. I overheard him say he wanted to ask us a question but was not good at English. I told him in Japanese that he was welcome to ask his question in Japanese. His girlfriend did not look amused. My friend and I had not addressed her earlier mocking. After chatting briefly with the boyfriend, my friend gave them the small souvenirs she had brought from Germany. She said she felt petty and wanted to win her over with kindness. Story 12. I was once giving a tour of our facility to a group of exchange university students from various countries. One of the students from the United Kingdom asked detailed questions about the facility, such as the wattage of the solar panels and the electrical consumption compared with the brightness of the overhead lighting. Those were not questions most people would ask, but they made sense from an engineering or environmental science perspective. 2 or 3 of the other students began speaking among themselves in Mandarin, calling him a suck-up and saying they wished he would be quiet. The student from the United Kingdom turned to them and told them off in excellent Mandarin. That quieted them for a while, but a few minutes later they started again in the more obscure Fuzhou dialect, complaining that some people were overly sensitive and asking the guide to ignore the loudmouthed foreigner. To their mortification, the British student told them off again, this time in Fuzhou. In short, a couple of recent Xiamen University graduates are left feeling thoroughly embarrassed. Story 13. I used to work as a hostess at a sports bar. A couple of girls who sat near the hostess stand were talking about me in our native language, but I am Americanized for our culture, so they had no idea I shared their ethnicity. I do not recall what they were saying, because it was more than 10 years ago, but it was definitely trash talking. When they were leaving, I said goodbye in our language. They both froze, looked at each other for a second, then ducked their heads and left. Felt satisfying to see them feel so stupid. Story 14. Our office had a maintenance guy who referred to me as the pretty one in Spanish. I didn't let on for months that I spoke Spanish because, quite frankly, it was nice. Story 15. I am the whitest of white girls, but I also spent a few years in East Africa and speak and understand Swahili pretty well. Children there loved to scream Mzungu Jambo, a grammatically incorrect tourist greeting meaning something like white person hello. That stopped when I answered them in Swahili, and I suddenly received the respectful greeting appropriate for elders that they should have used all along. Story 16. When I was in Japan, I visited an antique store and asked the price in broken Japanese. My understanding is better than my speaking. The assistant told me the price, then turned to another employee and said, "She can't afford anything in here." They both laughed. I replied in Japanese that I had understood and walked out. I'm sure they were mortified, but I wanted to cry. I was so embarrassed. Story 17. I worked in London in a warehouse. After a night shift, I was on the underground heading home, dirty and wearing baggy pants. 2 women spoke Afrikaans about how dirty I looked and how awful I appeared. When I got off the train, I told them to enjoy the rest of their holiday. Story 18. A few years ago, I was in Dubai. A small group of French tourists, mostly wannabe fashionistas, were taking pictures. At one point, they complained that I was ruining the shots, saying "Il y a un pétasse en arrière-plan," which means there is a bitch in the background. I turned around and said désolé in a sarcastic tone. Their faces immediately flushed and they mumbled, "No, it's fine." Story 19. Not a spectacular story, but this triggers a fun memory. When I was a kid, we went to France for our summer holidays, staying in the middle of nowhere. The closest town was 6 kilometers away, and one neighbor rented out their villa. As an only child, I was often alone with my parents during those holidays. When I was 11 or 12, I was lucky. A family with a daughter my age rented the villa, and she and I became friends quickly. They were bilingual in French and Dutch. I spoke Dutch, basic French, and a little English at the time, so most conversations were in Dutch. At one point, the daughter's 2 cousins, also our age but boys, came to visit. I think they lived in South Africa and spoke English and French. Most conversations with them were in French, but they spoke a lot of English between themselves, especially when they did not want us to understand what they were saying. It was all quite innocent, like talking about pranks they wanted to pull, kid stuff. Although I did not speak much English, I could understand most of what they were saying. At the end of their visit, I was in the swimming pool by myself under a fountain we had made with a hose. One of the boys got into the water and asked if I was okay. I said yes. His face was hilarious. You could see the realization hit him that I had understood him and his brother all along, followed by a very embarrassed exclamation that I could understand them. Story 20. So I'm a German line cook working in Brussels. We have an open kitchen, so we can usually hear clearly what is being said at the nearest tables. Last week, a group of around 10 German-speaking customers sat at the table right next to my kitchen and spent a large part of their time criticizing how spicy my dishes were and saying there was too much seasoning. Trust me, it is not like that. German people just have the most boring tastes. Just before they left, I walked past them and said, Einen schönen Abend und danke für Ihre Meinung. Story 21. I was hiking and overheard a group arguing in Japanese about whether to take the trail to a lake because the sign said it was 2 miles away. They were trying to figure how far that was in kilometers and whether it was too far. As I walked by, I said, It's 0.2 miles, not far. One of them said, That man just spoke to me in Japanese. The others called her silly. I turned back and said, It's 0.2 miles, less than 400 meters, bowed, and left. Story 22. I was in a souk in the Middle East. One of the shopkeepers was speaking ill of me. I am a Caucasian woman. The others stayed quiet. I continued browsing, listening to the man who was clearly bored and amusing himself. He had some items I wanted, but I planned to buy from someone else because he kept talking. One shopkeeper told me in English how much some perfume bottles cost, and I replied in Arabic. Everyone went silent for a moment, and then everyone except that one shopkeeper burst out laughing. One man asked in Arabic how much Arabic I understood. I glanced at the rude man and said I understood quite well. Thank you. He laughed, ran off to fetch us all some tea, and the other shopkeepers announced that the rude man would take 50% off everything in his stock for me, which he did. We all ended up friendly after that. Whenever I brought a friend, someone would tell them the story of how I started frequenting their part of the souk. Story 23. When I was working as a waitress, I was about 17 and worked in a cafe mostly frequented by German tourists. I did not speak German, so I spoke English to those tables and checked to the few customers who were not tourists. A French couple came in and ordered in English. I did not feel like speaking French that day, so I let them struggle with English a bit. They complained about the food, the drinks, and almost everything, which was funny because they acted as if everything was fine when I checked on them. When they were paying, I said thank you, have a nice day in French. The shock on their faces made my day. Story 24. Yes, it was something nice, so I didn't mention it. She later realized I could understand her and blushed when she remembered I had heard what she said to her friend. We became a couple soon after. Story 25. I used to hear it occasionally when I lived in Rio de Janeiro. I speak American English fluently without a foreign accent. I also speak Portuguese with a Brazilian accent. I am very pale and skinny with dyed but natural-looking golden copper hair. I would hear people talking casually about how I was probably a gringa or a tourist and so on. Nothing malicious most of the time, but occasionally I would hear comments about how I needed some feijoada and a day at the beach. One day I turned around and said, "So you want to give me a sunburn and gas?" They were not expecting that. I laughed it off because they looked very uncomfortable, and eventually they started laughing too. It was a group of older ladies. Story 26. I was fixing a computer at the Mexican embassy a few years ago when some young women were chatting in Spanish. I told them I spoke Spanish and they looked absolutely horrified, but I did not understand what they were saying. Story 27. Traveled to India in 2019 for what would turn out to be a harrowing advertisement filming job. Among many tasks I had to learn on the fly was how to speak and understand Hindi. Cut to 2 weeks ago, when one of my situationships needed help picking out a used car from a lot in Milton Keynes in the United Kingdom. Towards the end of the sale, the salesman began speaking to his staff in Hindi about how they were ripping her off, that they did not expect the car to make it back to London, and that it did not matter he had forgotten to fix a vital component. I was surprised that I still understood. Something learnt during a period of stress sticks with you. After subtly learning their background by talking to his son from the same area of India where I learnt Hindi so I would not misunderstand any dialect, I told the salesman in Hindi that I would greatly appreciate it if he would replace the broken component he was trying to stiff us with and reduce the price as compensation for his dishonesty. After a back and forth that made clear I knew exactly what he had said and left him feeling crushed as if in a vice, he dropped the price significantly, repaired the parts while we waited, and apologized enough to make me sick of the word. Our mechanic said the car still should not have passed its Ministry of Transport test but was glad we got it for the low price. Story 28. I was living in London for a while when a group of French Lyceens started criticizing the British. Since I normally speak French, I went up to them and said, "Don't assume there isn't at least one person on the bus who understands French." I was embarrassed by their lack of respect, and they felt the same after I spoke to them. Story 29. This was about 6 or 7 years ago. I was in Mexico at a restaurant with my brother-in-law. We always speak English together. He is Mexican and I am not. The place was packed. We were sitting at a table for 6, just the two of us. An elderly couple asked if they could sit with us. My brother-in-law said yes. The older gentleman looked at me and said hello. I said hello. He asked, "Do you like Mexico?" I said yes. He asked, "Do you like Mexican people?" I said yes. He asked, "Do you like Mexican food?" I said yes. He looked at my brother-in-law and asked in Spanish, "Donde encontraste al gringo?" which means, "Where did you find the American?" My brother-in-law replied in Spanish, "Él es mi cuñado y también habla español," which means, "He is my brother-in-law and he also speaks Spanish." The older gentleman then said hola to me. After that, the couple did not say a word. Story 30. I lived in China for a while. My ex is Chinese. Sometimes, when he was not with us, people would start picking apart our children's features to decide whether they were Chinese. I would answer in Chinese that their father is Chinese. They would quickly walk away. My ex thought I should tell them they were the love children of some Chinese leader, but I never had the nerve. Story 31. I found out my boyfriend long ago was cheating on me when his friends were discussing it in German. They immediately realized I knew what they were talking about from the look on my face. One guy said, "Shit, you know German, don't you?" I told him I knew enough to understand. Needless to say, that guy quickly became my ex. Story 32. A father told his daughter not to get in my way while I was in a very small convenience store with them. That language is not spoken where I live. I was traveling within my country, so I was surprised to hear it. Mine is not as interesting as the others. It is more pragmatic. Story 33. I was in China, walking toward an event through a crowd. A couple of kids beside me said in Chinese, "Look, there's a foreigner." I turned and their eyes widened. They asked if I spoke Chinese and I said a little. We chatted for a short time. As they were talking, their mother came up from behind and asked why they were talking to me, saying I did not speak Chinese. I looked at her and said in Chinese that I spoke a little. She immediately had the same surprised expression they did. It was a fun interaction. Story 34. I was in Germany with my mom visiting my uncle. I'm an American citizen, but German is my first language and I speak both languages fluently. The three of us were on the bus returning from my uncle's doctor's appointment. I said something in English to my mom because the medical terminology escaped me for a moment. We heard some older teens or young adults sitting in front of us talking about how I was a dumb American and should get out of their country. They tried to show off their English skills. English is still commonly taught in school, but their English was poor, as if they had been asleep in class. I started correcting their English in German. I said I might be a dumb American, but at least I speak both languages fluently and correctly. Story 35. I was climbing the monument to the Battle of the Nations in Leipzig, Germany, with a group of American students. Someone behind us complained in German, "Fat Americans are going so slowly." I replied, "We're not all that fat." It was true. We were a pretty fit group overall. Story 36. When my mom and I turned down a street vendor at a cruise port in Mexico, he called us stupid black assholes. When I repeated it in English, he suddenly said they were not talking about me. Story 37. Many years ago, as I sat in a tram in Zurich trying to relax after a long day of work, a man tried to hit on me in very broken English with a heavy French accent. I told him to leave me alone in English. He then complained about me to his friend in French. At the time I was almost fluent in French, so I told him off before I got off. The look on their faces was priceless. Story 38. I am a white woman who lived in Ghana for a while for work and learned enough Twi to get by, to exchange pleasantries, ask for directions, haggle for pineapple, and so on. It was unusual to see foreigners in that town, let alone ones who could speak Twi, so I guess word got around. One morning I was in line at a small shop before work, probably buying some Nescafe or a snack. The woman in front of me was talking to the shopkeeper and kept furtively looking back at me. The shopkeeper stopped her, pointed at me, and said that I spoke Twi. Her eyes widened and she stammered an apology. I was not paying attention and had no idea what she said, but it was clearly not kind, so I pretended to accept it. When I reached the front of the line, I thanked the shopkeeper in Twi for having my back. Story 39. I was checking out some Hispanic women at the grocery store register. They spoke about me in Spanish, explicitly and sexually. I counted back their change in Spanish. One of them came back later and things happened. Story 40. Not me, but my now ex-stepsister. She knew enough Spanish to speak informally after having dated Spanish men most of her life. She looks like the typical white woman from the United States. Spanish women especially used to say all sorts of insulting things, assuming she would not understand when she and her boyfriend were out. So she always delighted in turning on her heels and telling them off in the same language, laughing out loud. Story 41. This reminds me of a funny story from a vacation in Southeast Asia. My now husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, and I were traveling and decided to get a couple's massage. The two people giving us massages were chatting in the local language. They were mostly gossiping innocently about where they thought we were from, then began commenting on how handsome my boyfriend was. He was fluent in the language, and I could see a small smile appear at the corner of his lips. I thought to myself that if he did not say anything, there was no way this was going to be a relaxing massage. I let them banter a bit more, and when one of them asked how long they thought we had been together, I replied in the local language that it had been 5 years. They immediately stopped talking. I could see my husband's face, and it was hilarious. After a few minutes of silence, we exchanged some friendly small talk and then left. Story 42. I hear that I look Italian a lot. I just went to Italy with my boyfriend. I stepped back and bumped into another American tourist who was in line, and she said softly, "Goddamn, watch yourself, idiot." Being from South Carolina, I replied, "Oh my gosh, I am so sorry, honey. I should pay more attention to where I am stepping," using a much more southern accent than I actually have and giving a fuck you smile. She looked very embarrassed and did not respond. Story 43. We were at the swap shop in Florida when my mom saw lamps she'd been searching for forever. She ran over, snatched up the lamps, and then saw the price. She turned to us and said in Romanian, "This dumbass doesn't know what he has. These are worth 3 times this price. Watch me haggle this old, fat man down even more." Then she turned to him and offered $50 less for both lamps. I'll never forget the man's smirk as he told her the price was double the sticker price just for her. I laughed out loud. She bought the lamps for double because she really wanted them and told us in the car that she was too embarrassed to say anything else. In our culture, respect for elders is taught from birth, and she broke her own rule. She said, "It serves me right. God must have been watching to humble me." The lesson didn't stick, but it's still funny to me. Story 44. I was climbing down a mountain in Japan, talking in French with my companion, when a German girl behind us on the narrow path complained that we were talking too slowly. When she walked past and there was finally a spot for me to step aside to let her pass, my companion told me what she had said, and I could not help but exclaim, "Ich so," which is German for "Oh, I see." Story 45. I was eating breakfast one morning at home. 2 workers came into the house to paint. They asked in Spanish how much longer I might be before finishing. I responded in Spanish that I was almost done. Thank you, Duolingo. Story 46. I am not fluent in Spanish, but I know enough to catch phrases and general meanings. My 10-year-old son and I went to a concert where most people dress in costumes because of the band's lore. We were in the elevator at our hotel with a few other people going to the concert when they began making fun of my son's costume, calling it cheap. I was very glad my son did not understand Spanish at that moment, because he had made the costume himself and was proud of it. Story 47. My husband accidentally stepped on an older gentleman's foot and heard him mutter, "Pies de payaso," which means clown feet in Spanish. Story 48. I live on the border between two countries. While most people in the neighboring country speak our language, only a few people in my country speak the neighboring language. Once I went to a bakery in the other country with a friend and our children. It was about 20 minutes before closing. My friend ordered everything in our language because she does not speak the other language. Then her son needed to use the toilet. The bakery has a customer restroom. As she took her son there, the woman behind the counter kept saying things like, "Be careful, it is slippery," and "Do not fall, the floor is still wet from mopping." At first we thought she was genuinely worried, but later we realized she just did not want to clean the toilet again. As soon as the door closed behind them, she began ranting to her coworker about how rude we were and how ill-bred our children were. She called us entitled and complained that we were using a restroom she had just cleaned 20 minutes before closing. When my friend returned with her son, I stood up and told the woman in her language that it is not a secret language. It is spoken by many millions of people, and I am in fact a teacher of this language. Story 49. While working in restaurants, a French couple made comments about my looks and hair as I approached the table. They also made fun of the decor and were obnoxiously rude. I served them entirely in English and thanked them in perfect French at the end. They were dead silent as they left. Story 50. When I was traveling in Australia, I ended up renting an apartment with two Japanese girls. I am not fluent, but I understand quite a lot. One was shocked that I had red hair, while the other called it pretty. When I thanked her for the compliment, she beamed at me, while the other looked as if she wanted to sink through the floor. Their Korean landlord laughed loudly and said they should have known better than to assume. I am a white woman. The girl who gave me the compliment was my best friend while I was in the country. Story 51. Once upon a time, when my mother's English wasn't very good, she had to see a doctor who could speak our mother tongue and Cambodian. During one visit, she sat between two older women who spoke rudely about her in our native language, openly and loudly. Then she received a phone call from me. After we hung up, she enjoyed peace and quiet until she was called in to see the doctor. The women sat there stunned. She laughed. Story 52. Usually it is nothing. Something like someone wondering why people are waiting at a light at a crosswalk. Once some younger laboratory technicians made crude comments about my appearance while I was on break, until I thanked them in their language as the elevator door closed. I also had a man once complain that nobody from the United States knew about the politics of his country. He was upset when I knew more about not only his federal government but also his state government than he did. Generally, I approach it like this. I will be friendly, but you need to learn not to assume because it will get you in trouble. Story 53. When my friend and I were traveling through Europe by train, we were in Italy eating our cheap lunch of bread and cheese, tearing the bread and using our little jackknives to cut the cheese. The others in the booth were all Italians. I heard one woman remark to another that we looked like Boy Scouts in a less than complimentary way. Not long after, she asked us if we spoke Italian. I answered, I speak English and French, but I understand Italian. It was fun to see them squirm, but she and the others were very nice and chatted with us for the rest of the trip. Story 54. I worked as a cashier in high school. One day, a group of 40-year-old men were being creepy and speaking inappropriately about me. I pretended not to understand while I rang them up. At the end of the transaction, I told them the change owed and, in their language, said have a nice day. Two of them turned bright red and froze. It was glorious, and I hope they learned a lesson. Story 55. I was in a tourist town in Yunnan, Western China. I saw a young tourist surreptitiously taking pictures of me while talking on her phone. She asked the person on the other end, "Chega la wai soi busoi? Do you think this foreigner is handsome?" I turned toward her, struck an exaggerated pose with my hand under my chin, and replied in a full-throated, "Soya." "Yeah, I'm handsome." I thought she was going to die. Story 56. I'm overweight. A couple made a comment about it in French, saying I was clearly American. Oui, je suis américain. Parlez plus lentement, s'il vous plaît. They looked in horror and walked away. Story 57. When I went to middle school and wore a uniform, tourists often assumed no one would speak English. That was 20 years ago, so some of the older generation did not yet speak English, but we teenagers definitely did because of the internet. Those men made disturbing sexual comments about 12-year-old girls in uniform, all while keeping a friendly smile and sometimes taking pictures. It made me extremely uncomfortable every time, but I was too shy and scared to speak up. Once an older girl intervened and swore at one of them. Another time, the tourist's friend poured his beer on him and looked at him in disgust. Other times we awkwardly ignored it and tried to get away. Story 58. I don't speak any other languages, but years ago on the New York City subway, a Russian man kept pointing at me and speaking suggestively to his friend. After a while, I pretended to film him with my phone because psychological warfare knows no language barriers. He became stoic and asked in broken English, "Do you speak Russian?" I just shook my head in disgust as the doors opened. Probably helped that all my ancestors wore babushkas. Story 59. I was getting my hair cut in Qatar, and I was the only customer. I was obviously American. I do not speak much Arabic, but I know a lot of curse words. The barber was softly humming Kuzomak, and I may have butchered the spelling, but it translates to your mother's vagina, which is extremely offensive. I cracked up laughing but did not say anything. He stopped humming and finished cutting my hair. Story 60. When I was 13, I was excited to hear Spanish. Instead, grown men were sexualizing me. I had been hearing this in English since I was 8, and it made me very sad, even though I was excited to use my new language skills. Story 61. I recently stopped by McDonald's after a shift at work ran late. The only people there, besides myself and the workers, were two men speaking Spanish. There is a construction project near this McDonald's, so I assumed they were traveling tradesmen. While I was waiting for my food, they started talking in Spanish about how fat I am and how they would have sex with me if I were skinnier. I am Latina and more or less pass as white because I am pale with hazel eyes, so they probably assumed I did not know Spanish. I was going to brush it off once I got my food, but the order was taking forever because of all the cars in the drive-thru. By the time I got my food, they had been insulting me for at least 10 minutes. On the way out, I stopped in front of them and told them in Spanish that I was going to go home and have sex with my tall, lean boyfriend and that they might have someone to come home and have sex with them too if they were not fat, short, and ugly inside and out. Then I stormed off. They shouted something behind me as I walked out, but I did not hear them clearly, nor did I care. Story 62. This happened over a decade ago. I was working at a department store. Some older men were talking about what they would do to me. They did not think I understood them. I walked up and asked, "And what if someone did all that to your daughters and wives?" They were not happy that I spoke up and filed a complaint against me. My managers supported me. They banned the two men from shopping at our store and canceled their custom orders. Story 63. This happened to a friend, not me. We were waiting in line at a food court with babies on our hips. The women behind us were conversing in Spanish, which I do not understand, but my friend speaks it fluently. Apparently one of them said to the other, "Watch, I am going to touch her baby." My friend suddenly whirled around and said something in Spanish that amounted to, "I would like to see you try." I did not understand what had happened until my friend explained later. The women behind us left the line after my friend yelled at them. Story 64. I speak several languages and English is technically not my first language, but no native English speaker can tell where I am from. People have spoken to me in English in my native country. Most of the time Italians are surprised that I speak Italian so well because I do not look like an Italian, And they are also surprised that my partner does not speak Italian, since many people assume he is Italian. I had a bad experience in Spain. They assumed I was British and did not speak Spanish, and they tried to make me pay for something covered by my European Union health card. The translator assumed I had been drunk when I broke my arm. I explained to the doctor how I broke my arm and that I do not drink. The translator's shocked face when I spoke Spanish was reward enough. I understand some people are not nice and someone might have had a bad experience with people from certain countries, but there is no reason to make assumptions and treat everyone badly because you think they are from another country. Looks can be deceiving, and it costs nothing to be kind. Story 65. My Spanish teacher's husband, Gordon, was a manager at a factory where most workers were Hispanic. They gave him the nickname Gordo. He did not speak Spanish and thought he was one of the guys. His wife had to tell him they were calling him Gordo, which means fat in Spanish. Story 66. I am of mixed white, Filipino, and Japanese heritage. However, I do not really look like any of those groups to the untrained eye. I grew up mostly around my Filipino family. Though I can only say basic phrases, I understand Tagalog perfectly. When I worked in customer service, a cute elderly Filipino couple came in. The woman was telling her husband in Tagalog that I was so pretty and wondering if I was Filipino. The man said, "You think everyone is Filipino?" I had to stifle my laughter because my mom is the same way. Later, they were discussing which option to buy in Tagalog. The man made a joke and I burst out laughing. They both froze and looked at me, shocked. I also froze because I was surprised. Then the woman broke the silence and asked, "You understood that? Are you Filipino?" The jig was up, so I confessed that I understood but did not speak it well. She smacked her husband on the arm and said, "I told you." We all had a good chuckle and chatted about our families a bit. They were lovely people. Story 67. I was on the opposite end of this, but I vividly remember a time from my childhood when my mom took me along for coffee with some of her friends, all Japanese. At the table next to us sat a white man with a dog. While they were chatting, he suddenly lashed out with his foot at his dog. My mom and her friends reacted in Japanese, calling him horrible, and the man, in perfect Japanese, said, "Do not talk about other people like that. You do not know what I am going through." The whole thing was wild from start to finish, and I laughed. Story 68. I speak some Russian. When I worked at a restaurant, many customers argued about what to order or about their orders. Typically, someone was upset with what they received and their friend would encourage them to speak up. When I joined in Russian, the issue was resolved and they usually agreed to a replacement or whatever they wanted. I live in Colorado, so it was surprising that it happened so often. Only one person seemed surprised. Since they were already speaking Russian to their friend, it made sense when someone else spoke Russian. Story 69. I overheard our French teacher's aide complaining about how terrible we were at speaking French. She said she knew toddlers who spoke French better than we did. I did not speak up. Instead, I either deliberately spoke French poorly or refused to speak it in front of her for the rest of the semester. Keep in mind that most of us had only started learning French a few years earlier, and we had one semester of French per year, so we were not able to learn very much. Story 70. English is my native language, and I speak French and Romanian. Once I was on a train next to a French family who were discussing how incredibly fat Americans were. At one point, I interjected with my best American accent, jokingly asking if the train had a dining car, and they died laughing. I had lived in France for several years at that point and was, coincidentally, on my way back to fly to the United States for the first time in a long time. On my arrival back home, I realized they were right. Another time, I was in a coffee shop in Bucharest and overheard a woman weighing options between two men she was dating. She said she really loved the Romanian man. The American man was annoying but had money and could help her get a United States visa. Story 71. Yes. I was an American living in a French-speaking area who had learned French but had hired a pet sitter who also spoke English. She and I spoke English together, so she might not have realized I spoke French, but she should have since I had been living there a long time. She asked for one visit and whether she could have a friend over for the evening while I was out of town. I thought it would be nice to buy a small girl's night basket with face masks, nail supplies, and chocolate as a thoughtful addition for someone whose work I valued. I had to wait to leave because she arrived before I finished packing. She was talking to her friend in the next room and said how really weird it was that I left a basket of items. She even used the word bizarre multiple times. It felt hurtful because my pets seemed to love her and what I did was benign and meant kindly. That experience has made me hesitant since. Story 72. The barber started talking shit about my haircut to his coworker, laughing out loud. Story 73. Only a few times. Both were kind of funny. I'm a very white American but speak Spanish fluently. I was walking my dog, who is a very muscular boxer, past some landscapers on a break, when one of them kind of elbowed his coworker and said, "See, she's got a macho dog." Another time I was on the bus and a somewhat tipsy couple got on. There were no two seats together, so the man sat next to me and told his partner in Spanish, "It's okay. I'll sit with this girl from the East here." I asked in Spanish, "Girl from the East? What does that mean?" His partner burst out laughing and he said it was a song title about meeting a pretty girl. Story 74. I know American Sign Language. One time at the gym, two deaf men were talking about how my chest moves when I run. American Sign Language is a visual language, and I doubt anyone had trouble understanding what they were saying, so my language skill was not relevant in that case. For reference, make the letter C with both hands, palms facing the ceiling. Place your hands in front of your chest and bounce them up and down. Now imagine someone doing that, then immediately pointing at you and continuing their conversation. Story 75. Okay, this is a bit off the original question, but I was at an obstetrics and gynecology appointment when I was pregnant. The nurses were taking vital signs on me and another pregnant woman who appeared Middle Eastern. Her nurse spoke rudely about how these people come to the United States, have children, and do not even speak English. She looked at me and my nurse as if we would agree with her and gang up on the woman, but my nurse looked uncomfortable. The rude nurse pushed a urine specimen cup toward the Middle Eastern woman and told her harshly to provide a sample. The woman looked unsure and anxious, and seemed on the verge of tears. I am Caucasian, but I know a little Arabic, so I asked the woman in Arabic if she understood. She looked surprised, then smiled broadly and indicated she knew what to do. I turned back to the rude nurse and gave her a look that said how unfortunate it is that people like her cannot be kind to those in difficult situations. Story 76. This is not about me, but about a clandestine affair between two colleagues. I was sitting next to them at morning tea. He was a good friend as well as a workmate. She was significantly older and filling a temporary position as a favor to the big boss. She was best friends with the big boss's wife. They knew I spoke some German but did not realize I understood it far better than my attempts at speaking suggested. They were discussing the date from the previous evening. I enjoyed teasing him with sly remarks and innuendo, for example about them arriving at work together, until the affair became public knowledge a few weeks later. Story 77. On an airplane, the couple seated next to me, the husband speaking to his wife, said that Americans are so stupid because they only speak English and we could not even talk to her. I waited until the flight was 3/4 over to start chatting with them. They did not speak any English. They were traveling to the United States. I was going home and they were on vacation. Story 78. One time I was shopping for earbuds in a small store when a woman began loudly whispering to the cashier, "Watch out for that guy. He's definitely stealing." The cashier knew me, so he just smiled and shook his head. After paying for the earbuds, I couldn't help but reply in the same words, "I'll steal from you next time, man." He laughed. She didn't. That was a win in my book. Story 79. I was on a boat with a group of strangers preparing to go scuba diving. I was pregnant at the time, so I did not go underwater, but I still wanted to be part of the experience. The site was in Peru. The tourists were international, and the common language on the boat was English, which has been my main language for a while. An American couple started a conversation with me, and we exchanged basic information in English. Another couple from Spain spoke in Spanish, asking each other why I was not diving and joking that I was not as crazy as they were. I heard them and understood, but I did not engage. After their dive, I spoke with them in Spanish and they were very kind to me. I think they were too shocked by the cold water to realize what they had said. but I am sure it occurred to them later. I have had too many experiences with Eastern European women making comments about my appearance, not realizing I understand. I used to respond occasionally, but now I feel sorry for their insecurities and do not engage. Story 80. This is not specifically about me, but once during the coronavirus pandemic when everyone was still wearing masks, my boyfriend and I went to Prague to meet my uncle. We boarded public transport, and two middle-aged men stood up from their seats. After my uncle was asked if he wanted to sit down, we remained seated, thinking. The men simply wanted to pass, but they stood there and spoke to him. I heard them say, "Yes, letting ladies sit is important." My uncle told them that the person with the longer hair was a man. They froze for a second and then continued talking among themselves, changing the subject. My boyfriend thought they were just being very kind. Story 81. I was on a bus in New York City when two German tourists next to me started talking about me in German. One of the women thought my coat was hideous. I decided to call my mom just to chat in German, laughing out loud. When I started talking on the phone, they both went beet red. I winked at them and laughed. Story 82. A woman my partner used to work with checked into a hotel in Cardiff for a work trip. There was a lot of noise overnight from partying guests, and she had to complain to reception several times to get it dealt with. The next morning, the two receptionists asked how her stay had been. She was appropriately negative. As they processed her checkout, they spoke to each other in fluent Welsh. As she was about to leave, she stopped, smiled, and said to them in equally fluent Welsh, "Thank you. I understood every word you just said." She then walked out, leaving the receptionists looking very nervous. The moral of the story: don't call your guest a whining bitch in Welsh without being certain the guest doesn't speak Welsh. Story 83. On my last trip to Italy, an Italian couple were arguing. I watched them and snickered. The woman made a comment about nosy tourists, so I clapped back and said, "Sorry, I thought this was performance art." She told me to fuck off to hell and they walked off. Story 84. I am 6 feet 4 inches, a white man with blue eyes. I was in Venezuela when a woman at the bar leaned toward her friend and in Spanish said that she loved guys with blue eyes. I am bilingual. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.